Hey, and welcome back to another episode of the Security Champions podcast. My name is Michael Birch. I'm the Director of Application Security for here at Security Journey and your host. Today I am joined by Ken Buckler. He's a research analyst in security and risk management and compliance, enterprise management associate. With over 15 years of experience, Ken is an author of cybersecurity books on cybersecurity basic, identity theft, digital threats to elections. He spent several years working on federal contracts in cybersecurity practitioner roles, and he began his career as a software tester, quickly moving into security-focused development role. Now, there's my quick pitch on Ken, but I think better than me to describe his history and his past is Ken Buckler himself. So Ken, how did you get into the world of security? What's your story that drove you here?
All right, so I'll actually go all the way back to elementary school, and you're really going to laugh about this, but when I was a kid, we had the Apple IIe's in our computer lab, and once a day we went to the computer lab and we did various programs, math, typing, whatever. Well, I've always been a very curious kid, and I've always tried to figure out how stuff works. And so I'm in this this typing program that measures how fast you can type. And I discovered that as long as I typed the first word correctly in the program, whatever I typed after that, even if it was wrong, it would give me partial credit for, and base my words per minute upon how fast I could type the entire thing, whether it was correct or not. So what I started doing, I would type the first word correctly, and then I'd just start pounding away a whole bunch of gibberish on the keyboard. And sometimes it was like twice as long as what I was supposed to type, but the program didn't care. And I ended up getting the computer to print out that I was doing 200 words per minute typing in elementary school. So
I think that's the youngest exploit I've heard on the show so far.
And the teachers, they didn't question it because they were like, "Oh, okay, well, he's doing really good." Okay. So that was really the start of me being interested in finding flaws in programs and exploiting them. Then of course that went into college. When I was in college and I was studying computer programming, and all the kids always hated it when they got paired with me to test their programs, because I'd always find something that they just never thought of, and that would just completely crash their program or something like that. So fast forward, after I get out of college, I get a job doing software testing for a federal contractor. This is actually custom software for the federal government, and they found that I had a very good knack for finding security issues with the software. Imagine that. So very quickly they moved me from a just software testing role to a security focused role. Initially just doing testing on the network for security vulnerabilities. Then finally they moved me to a development position when an opportunity came open where they had their own custom software that they needed to lock down. And I actually got assigned the duty of developing the custom lockdown software to lock down their software and actually lock down the entire systems. Really fun stuff, especially because I was working with a lot of technology that there weren't even security standards for yet. So I literally had to go into the generic security standards, develop the product-specific security standards as I was developing the actual lockdown software. So really interesting stuff. After that, then I started doing a lot of that across different federal contracting spaces. One of the big things that I started doing was I actually started working on security data analytics. And a lot of that was actually still custom programming, where I was writing the software to go in and analyze the data feed from wherever. I actually had a small team working with me on that, and I mentored a lot of the younger programmers, and really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed teaching them not only the security data analytics side, but how to make sure their own code was secure. I still remember the look on one of them's face when I going through their code, and I'm like, well, I can use this to completely compromise your code, right? He's like, what are you talking about? Yeah, all I have to do is put a single quote in here in the input field, and it lets me do a SQL injection attack. And he's like, well, why would a user do that? I'm like, well, the problem isn't why they would, it's that they can. So I've loved doing that stuff. And then a little over a year ago, I had an opportunity come up where Enterprise Management Associates had a job posting out there for a research analyst. And I'm like, that sounds interesting, because one of the things I've done with my job is I've always met with vendors, and I've always, learned about new technologies, and actually helped out the federal government with evaluating some of these technologies and deciding which vendors are worth pursuing, which ones aren't. And I really enjoyed doing that part. So when I started talking with EMA, and they told me that that's a large part of the job, and then the other part of the job is writing about what I learn. Well, I've written 3 cybersecurity books. I started writing those to get my continuing education credits for my security certifications, and so I was like, well, I've already written 3 books. I've got a lot of experience at that. I'm sold. Let's do it. They brought me on board, and I love it. It's some of the best, most fulfilling career I've had so far is going in here and helping out companies understand their market, understand their customer base better, because I've got that hands-on practitioner experience, so I understand what those practitioners are looking for when it comes to the cybersecurity products. So it's really been a very fulfilling experience.
Now that we've talked about your background, before we kind of dive into what we're really here to talk about today, and that's the human side of coding, we're going to take a quick pause and get a couple words from our sponsorship.
The Cybersecurity Awesomeness podcast, hosted by leading IT analyst firm Enterprise Management Associates, takes a deep dive into the security topics that are top of mind for information security practitioners, IT professionals, and technology business leaders. Join security experts Chris Steffen, Managing Research Director at EMA, and Ken Buckler, Research Analyst at EMA, to get insights into today's hottest security topics. Visit cybersecurityawesomeness.com to listen to past episodes and to learn how you can sponsor an upcoming episode.
Welcome back to the Security Champions podcast. I'm Michael Birch, your host. I'm joined by Ken Buckler, the security research analyst from EMA, and we're here to talk about the human side of secure coding. And Ken Buckler's actually done a recent research project about secure coding practices. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that I've always thought was very important that is often overlooked is the human side of cybersecurity, the human side of software development when it comes to securing the code. There's a lot of reliance on tools that are designed to scan code. There's a lot of reliance on code reviews, but it's not as much reliance on actually learning how to write that code securely in the first place. And I've always kind of wondered, how effective are code reviews if you don't actually invest in that learning? So I set out to do some research and figure out, what strategies are actually working. How are organizations securing their code? What's working? What isn't? And what I really found interesting was that the organizations that invested in training always, or almost always, had improvements in their code security. At the same time, the organizations that were investing in tools and code reviews without investing in that training didn't see nearly as often for code security improvement. So it's clear that code security is very reliant upon being able to train your people how to write that code securely in the first place. And then the other interesting part that I found during the research was that a lot of organizations are absolutely struggling when it comes to secure software development life cycles. So it was only like 25% have adopted a shift left model, where shifting left, putting security earlier in the code development cycle, versus I think it was 5% have a legacy model where it's security gets applied after the fact. But then the remainder of organizations don't even have complete life cycles for security when it comes to software development. It's kind of scary when you think about it that here we have these organizations that they're developing all this code, and in some cases they're not even validating that their security measures are working, or in a lot of cases they're not planning those security measures in the first place. So, and I did a lot of cross analysis on what strategy is working best, and I found that yes, shift left definitely does improve code security most often, and the organizations that were missing steps were completely struggling to even improve at all. Most of them actually were working backwards. It was kind of scary.
Yeah, I definitely, in the industry, the way the verbs I like to use for these are proactive and reactive, right? We have I think a lot of the industry is stuck in this very reactive state where we're going to throw in a tool and react to what it gives us and then start adding security that way, rather than the proactive, right? The shift left, and let's plan security in, build our controls, validate they're working, and then test at the end to make sure they're working. And the testing is the validation rather than the driving tool for what we're doing for security. So one of the big things I guess I would like to ask from that kind of part of this research is maybe can you glean some of the maybe driving factors of why this is such a slow adoption? I mean, I'm from the security world, so we hear every day, hey, shift left, right? Everyone should be shifting left. Everyone should be doing security throughout. What's preventing that from really catching on as an industry standard versus just a keyword that security people put out there?
Well, so there's two main factors. The first factor is developers not caring about security, looking at security as a pain instead of looking at it as a necessity. A lot of that has been driven by traditional code security models where developer writes the code, they get it working, and then security comes along and breaks the code and tells them, well, you can't write it that way, sorry. But then security, because the security team isn't traditionally developers, they don't really know how to tell you how to fix it. They just tell you, well, yeah, it's a problem. And then the other side of the coin is productivity goals. There's a huge push for developers to get code out on time, and unfortunately they take shortcuts, and part of those shortcuts are going ahead and just bypassing security measures. The problem with that is it's actually counterintuitive, and my research actually showed this, that by doing that, by using that traditional security model where you're by using that traditional security model where you're applying security after the fact or not even applying security in the first place, what ends up happening is you then spend more time later on cleaning up your mess instead of actually being able to just do it right the first time and keep going. So it's very interesting, and once again it ties into the human side of things. It's not a technical challenge. We know how to secure the code. The challenge is convincing the developers that it's worth the time, convincing the project managers that they need to invest the extra time up front to avoid more time later.
I think it's an interesting aspect when you think about that, because you could try to get to the root cause of that problem, right? And I mean, I think even, especially with me having a developer background, the idea isn't necessarily that the developers don't want to do it the first time, right? Like, the developers usually have ownership of what they want to do. They enjoy the quality of product they create, and they have like, hey, I'm proud of the thing I'm working on. It's just, especially when you spend so much time and effort and you create this thing that you're proud of, and then you hand it to someone else and they just dash it and say, you know what, this sucks, throw it back, start over, and that's it. Like, that's a hard pill to swallow for something that, like, for your productivity, right? So there has to be something that we fix in the process that's best for everybody. Because it's not that I don't think the developers don't necessarily, they're not saying they don't want to do it right. They're doing what they think is right, and then security people are coming in and they're telling them, no, you're wrong, and then there's no good, like, process there to make sure that we're doing it right the first time, right? Because I think that right there is going to relieve a lot of that stress. Is like, hey, as long as we prepare them to do it right the first time, this whole process becomes a whole lot smoother, right?
Well, and also too, a lot of the problem is that developers and the security team, because of this friction, basically, they very often have an antagonistic relationship, and the developers seem to feel that the security team only exists to be getting in their way, and the security team has a equally bad view of the developers. That the developers just don't want to listen, and they don't understand why it's so important to apply the security measures. So we really need to try to overcome that antagonistic relationship and get the developers and the security team to work together instead of at odds with each other.
So what are some of the ways, and from your research, were you able to kind of come up with some potential ideas of how to kind of tackle this problem more effectively?
Well, and that's actually where, training really comes into play. Especially when it comes to more hands-on training. If a developer understands why a vulnerability is bad, then they're more likely to try to work to fix that. It's like, when I, showed the one developer, hey, I can enter in just this really short snippet of code into an input box in your program, and it's going to give me, complete control of your program, or dump all of the contents in memory, or just crash the program. When they see that, when they actually watch it happen, and they're there and participating as it happens, that becomes a lot more real to them than a member of the security team giving them a checklist of, here's everything that we found that's wrong with the software, go fix it. It's really about convincing the developers the importance by showing them the consequences.
It's especially difficult when you look at this problem when a security person, their entire mindset is, I just want to lock down everything as hard as I can all the time so I can be as secure as possible. And is when I come in and like, hey, every single vulnerability always needs to fix no matter what. And that's not necessarily always the best approach, right? Especially when we're not planning security in, or necessarily maybe the developer did take that proactive step, right? That developer went out and they're like, hey, I know there's a potential vulnerability here, but I have to use this software package or something, right? So they put in a security control to help mitigate that threat. It doesn't mean it won't stop it from maybe popping on a scanning tool, right? Now, if security takes that, throws it over the edge and says, hey, fix this, we have this whole other divide because they lack of communication, right? So one of the biggest things I'd say for us on both sides that I've seen is security needs to take that proactive approach where they talk to the developers and they actually have a in-depth conversation about, hey, here's the vulnerabilities we saw and the potential threats we've seen. Are there any security controls currently to prevent these? Okay, if they're not, what can we do to fix this? Do we need to fix code? Do we need to add security controls? Have that more in-depth and conversation, because using those soft skills, using that good communication is going to not only help with us getting adopting security from the development side, but it's going to make the entire buy-in from both sides better, right? We're starting to work as one team instead of siloed and against each other. Now, moving on to kind of some more recent events, I was actually wondering if, with all this talk about secure coding and training and teaching developers, right now, there's not a lot of things driving that as a huge requirement unless you're in an industry like PCI or you have very specific security requirements that aren't set by your company, but the industry. But we are having a lot of movement in the space of the national cybersecurity strategy that's kind of up and coming, where there's a huge kind of threat of liability to people making these products if they are not doing it correctly. Do you have any kind of opinions on how this might influence the human-sided coding, or really kind of your opinions on this strategy of this, hey, do it right or you're going to be in trouble approach?
So, there's two sides to, there's two methods to get someone to act on something. There's the carrot approach and there's the stick approach. The carrot approach is you reward somebody for good behavior or give them incentives. The stick approach is you threaten punishment if they don't listen and do what you do, or do what you say. The current cybersecurity strategy that's being rolled out by the White House is more of a stick approach. I have some concerns on that because a lot of times what happens is when people come out with a stick, they tend to fight back, and they tend to tell you, hey, I'm not doing what you're telling me to do. But then also another concern as well is that, well, all right, we're talking about making organizations liable for their security vulnerabilities. Well, the problem with that is a lot of organizations aren't going to care about that very much. They're just going to say, well, that's why I have liability insurance, and they're going to move on. And they might actually end up being less secure because they're going to pay less attention to the vulnerabilities and actually just be like, okay, well, I got insurance to cover me. I'm fine. I think that a better approach might be to take the carrot approach and actually have funding, grants, stuff like that to be able to encourage development, encourage innovation when it comes to secure software development, and really encourage people to step up in the space. I also think that, I've been a developer. I've worked with a lot of developers. Ultimately, they want to write better code, but they don't see it as a bonus, as a good thing necessarily if they're writing more secure code. If we make it so that having the ability to write secure code is a more marketable skill, then developers will start lining up to start learning how to write better code. And I think that's probably going to be a better strategy for us than the stick approach.
Yeah, definitely. I like that carrot idea. Imagine if the government came out and said, instead of we're just going to fine everybody and this huge liability if you don't do it, well, prove to us. If you can prove to us you implemented these security practices, we'll give you a tax break. Or monetize it, right? Like that's a whole different side of the house, right? And that works with developers, kind of like you said there too, right? How do we monetize and use the carrot approach with our developers instead of the stick? Because I think too often, and I actually work for a security vending company, and I get actually questions all the time from potential customers or customers like, hey, I want to be able to find out exactly who wrote this vulnerability, and I want to be able to go out to him and be like, hey, you wrote this, and we need to fix this. And it's kind of like that stick approach, like get into the blame game of why this vulnerability showed up. And I usually push back on that pretty hard because I think the principle there's wrong. I think the principle is, okay, well, let's aggregate. Let's see the vulnerabilities you're seeing across the organization, and then let's incentivize and train these people to be better at making sure that those things don't show up in the future, rather than trying to play that blame game. Because I think that gives security such a bad name, right? When we're always the bad guys in that story, right? I want to be the good guy. I want to be the guy that comes and says, hey, I got something good for you to do. Take my training, learn, become security good, learn the security goodness here, and then we'll actually give you an extra bonus at the end of the year if you complete all this training. Or we'll give you an extra day off. We'll give you something and reward you for adopting this, rather than try to scare you into it.
Yeah.
So
I think that would be a lot better approach.
Yeah, I think positive reinforcement is always a good place to be for everybody involved. So as we talk about the developers and their role in writing secure coding, this is the Security Champions podcast, so I got to ask you kind of your viewpoint on security champions and the role they play in this.
So ultimately, the ideal way would be for an organization to have a member of the development team who is a champion for secure coding, who makes it their mission to communicate with the other developers and talk to them about the advantages of secure coding. And this wouldn't even necessarily have to be somebody on a supervisory level, and actually I'd prefer it wouldn't be. I think that a great approach would be have a peer that promotes to other security or other software developers the importance of security when it comes to coding, and how it's going to ultimately make for less work in the long run by developing secure code in the first place. But also, and like I mentioned earlier, we need to start making secure software development a more marketable skill. We need to make it so that, oh, hey, you're actually trained in secure software development. All right, well, we'll give you a slight pay increase for joining the company. Stuff like that is how we shift our mindset from the current checkbox compliance approach to security to a more holistic, human-based approach.
You know, it's funny, in the way you actually mentioned that, makes me think of, so I have a military background, right? And one of the things we'd always get when we went on deployments or overseas or something is they give us something called hazardous duty pay, right? We would get a little bit of extra money, a little thing to reward us for the fact that we're going to put ourselves into threats way, right? And the idea kind of maybe bringing that back to like, hey, all right, so like let's call it the security champions duty pay, right? You're now taking on this extra role as the security champion, and you're going to be in hazard, right? You're pivoting yourself between the development and security team. I feel that's slightly hazardous, right? I'll give you a little hazard duty pay for taking on that role and being that liaison to help support both efforts. Now, as we are kind of winding down here, one of the questions I always ask every guest, and I think it's important to kind of tackle, is how would you suggest companies tackle the divide between security and development? Because I think it's a huge thing. It's actually even RSA is bridging this, right? It's talking about bridging the divide. That's like the big theme this year is how do we bring these teams closer together?
Well, and it also goes beyond just the security team, the development team, but also the IT operations team and really even just the everyday users. And we need to pull these users together, pull the developers together, pull the security team together, and we need to have good conversations about why security is important. Get away from just the checklist security. The problem with checklist security is that people look at it as, okay, I checked all these boxes, I'm done. And checklist security needs to be a starting point, not the finish line. We need to start having these open conversations about the consequences of not securing our software, not securing our workstation, not securing our servers. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is actually have open, honest conversations on a human level and talk about the human consequences.
I definitely agree with what you're saying. I may be a little biased because I work for a security training company, and what we do is we tell you to train your developers, right? So I will acknowledge that bias, but I do it because I believe it's true, right? Like I really think that's the way we tackle and solve this problem. I just want to say, hey, thank you, Ken, for joining us. It's been great conversation, a lot of good information here. I think that people are going to be able to take away and apply in their environment. I want to thank the whole audience for joining us again for another episode and listening to us talk about security-related topics. Please join me for our next episode. We're going to meet with another security expert, and we're going to dive into security topics that will give you something actionable to work with in your environment. And remember, security is a journey, not a destination.